So we're going to begin with a prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we give thanks for this day, for this chance to gather together, to learn, to grow in our understanding of our world. We ask that you give us open hearts and open minds as we engage in this conversation and in this process of learning. All this we pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. Well, welcome everybody. We are very blessed today to have Professor Alan Shaw Taylor, Professor of History at UVA with us. I'll just embarrass him for a moment. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner, I believe twice. Is that right? Twice. So that doesn't happen very often, and we're really quite fortunate to have his wisdom and knowledge with us this morning. He will be talking about the education of Thomas Jefferson and how that connects to the founding of the University of Virginia. So, Alan, I thought we might start by just having an overview of TJ's education and how that led to the emergence of UVA.
Thomas Jefferson's education has a double meaning, so it means his own education. And I realize there are at least two people here from William and Mary.
We got a couple.
But it's also about how he comes to think about the place of education in American society, and specifically in Virginia society. And Virginia was the nation's largest state in territory and in population when the country began. And so Virginians had a great notion that they should be running the country, and they largely did. But during Jefferson's lifetime, Virginia starts to slip economically and in population relative to northern states, especially Pennsylvania and New York. And as it does so, Jefferson becomes more and more convinced that the way for Virginia to go forward, kind of rally itself and to hold its place in the country, is by developing a better educational system. He would very much have liked for a comprehensive educational system that would have included primary school education for all white kids, which for its time was radical because he was talking about including girls as well as boys. That didn't get very far. There wasn't enough money to do it or enough political will. So when he was forced to choose, he decided, okay, what I need to do then is to change the leaders of Virginia first, and therefore I'm going to found a university. So the book is about that process of Jefferson founding the university, what shape the university took, and why it emerges when it does, which is a very unlikely time for any state to invest in higher education because it comes during a severe depression.
So, Thomas Jefferson, of course, was a graduate of the College of William and Mary. Like many other sons of elite families, had been raised or educated there. And I understand that people were concerned about the quality of the education there, as you said, and they were sending their children up to New England, heaven forbid, to be educated up there as opposed to Virginia. What was the problem with the education system at that time? What were people concerned about?
So you want me to dwell on the problems of William and Mary?
We'll start there, yeah. We'll start there.
It takes a long time. Can you hear me? Yeah. This is coming through.
Yeah, you just have to hold it a little
I have to hold it close, right?
Okay. You can turn it up on the system.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
So when Jefferson goes to William and Mary, it is the only college in the entire South. There were very few colleges in colonial America. So there were basically a handful. All of them were in the North except for William and Mary. So the elite families, the wealthy families, the large slaveholders of Virginia, they wanted their sons to go to a college. And the primary choice was William and Mary, and the secondary choice was Princeton. The more Presbyterian-oriented would go off to Princeton, such as James Madison went there. But by and large, the children of the wealthier families in Virginia, they go to William and Mary. Almost nobody graduated. So if it was a different time, you'd go for a year or two to kind of make some connections, get some social graces, and then you went home to run your plantation and then to run for a seat in the House of Burgesses. So Jefferson did not graduate from William and Mary, but that didn't make him unusual, because there were only probably a handful of people who graduated, went the full term. You were kind of considered a real grind if you did that. And you probably weren't an appropriate leader for Virginia. So when the Revolution comes along, though, it's a transfer of power out of the Tidewater region, which had traditionally governed Virginia. The leaders of Virginia had come from the counties from the Tidewater. During the Revolution, the leadership switches to the Piedmont. So people like Jefferson and Patrick Henry and George Mason and Madison are the new leaders of Virginia. And they have a very dim view of Tidewater. And there's some reason for it. Tidewater's older, the soil had been overcropped for many years, declining fertility. It's also subject to malaria, which was a severe problem in Virginia, whereas the Piedmont less subject. So economically, Williamsburg is declining. The capital moves out of there to Richmond during the Revolution, and when the capital moves out, the primary economic base for the town collapsed, because there really was no good reason for Williamsburg to exist. It's not on the navigable river. It's not on the fall line. The only reason that it really existed was it was a compromise between various places in Tidewater when it got established as the capital in the 17th century. But it's a dangerous location during the Revolution because the British were operating in Chesapeake Bay. So they moved the capital to Richmond, and that's a symbol of the transfer of power. So Williamsburg by the 1790s is a semi-ghost town. Half of the buildings are boarded up. The newspapers are gone. They've moved out. Most of the small businesses have moved out. So there's a perception of Williamsburg, an accurate one at that time, that it's a dying community with a dying college. Because the sons of the Piedmont don't really want to go there. It's not an attractive place to go anymore. Its funding base has been radically cut. It had received a lot of government funds before the Revolution. Those are cut off. So it can't afford a first-rate faculty. So this is then an opportunity. Either the state can try to revive William and Mary, or they can found a new institution. And people like Madison and Jefferson are based in the Piedmont. What they want to do is found a new university rather than say William and Mary.
And what specifically were they hoping young leaders of Virginia would learn at this new university?
Well, Jefferson is a man of the Enlightenment. He's somebody who believes very devoutly that you need to break the tradition. You need forms of learning that are experimental. So he refers to any body of knowledge which is new and is subject to rational inquiry and testing of the evidence as a science. So he referred to the science of government, or the science of history, or the science of law, as well as what we would call science. So what Jefferson wants the university to teach is science, but science in this very broad definition. What he doesn't want taught is theology. He has his own particular vision of Christianity, which is one that is not particularly theological. And so there will be, in his vision, there'll be no chapel at UVA, there will be no professors of religion, it will be purely science.
And what in particular did he find objective about theology? So, of course, in the Middle Ages, theology was called the queen of the sciences. They used that word science in a different sort of way. So what was it, based on his Enlightenment worldview that he objected to in religion? Why do you think it was harmful for education?
Well, when he had gone to William and Mary, it was a very traditional English-style Anglican institution, which meant that all the faculty members were considered Anglican priests. There were prayers every morning that all students had to go to. There were prayers in the evening, and there was obligatory service on Sunday they had to go to. Now, the boys who were going, and I'm calling them boys because they were, the age at which they're going to William and Mary, they're 13, 14, 15 years old. And 13, 14, 15-year-old boys, even then, didn't like to sit still. So
teenagers have always been complaining about the church.
So, but, it was a rite of passage, and for generations, leading Virginians had done this, and it was just part of the old order of things. I think we sometimes forget how much the Revolution changed. And Jefferson just recoiled against all of that. And so when he is setting up his institution, he wants there to be no religious association whatsoever. The Anglican Church had been very dependent upon public funding through parish taxes under the old regime before the Revolution. And Jefferson and Madison are key players in ending that support. Now, they hoped that the tax would live on, but it would be used to fund public education. But instead, the voters said, no, we just want to lower our taxes. So the parish churches in much of Virginia were deprived of essential funding. Eventually, their glebe lands were confiscated and sold. And so the Anglican Church, which went from having about 100 parishes in Virginia and having a well-educated ministry, was virtually wiped out. You're down to about 25 parishes. But it doesn't mean people don't want to go to church. It just means they're going to different kinds of churches, which are dependent on a less educated ministry supported by voluntary contributions. So it's Baptist number 1 and Methodist number 2. And then number 3, Presbyterians that do have a well-educated ministry. So the Presbyterians are kind of the rising stars among the leading families of Virginia. The leading families of Virginia are still more or less Anglican, or they're like Jefferson, they're dabbling in deist ideas.
Nominally Anglican?
In many ways, Jefferson's still nominally Anglican. Yeah. But he insists he's a Unitarian. Mm-hmm. And Jefferson can say some pretty wild things. And one of the things he said was that he expected in the next generation every young man would be a Unitarian, which doesn't come remotely true and shows that Jefferson doesn't understand the emotional importance of religion. Religion was not emotional for Jefferson. So the religious landscape is changing, and Jefferson's fear is that what's going to happen in the future, the only thing that could preempt this wonderful Unitarian future in Jefferson's mind are the Presbyterians. Okay. And the Presbyterians have established a couple of colleges after the Revolution. One's Hampton-Sydney, and the other is what is now Washington and Lee. They were small, they're underfunded, but the Presbyterians are kind of dabbling with maybe we can get state funding and we can build these institutions up, which are both in the Piedmont or in the Valley. And that Jefferson wants to fend that off.
Yeah, it's remarkable. You mentioned the collapse of Anglicanism in Virginia at the time of the Revolution, just after, and people were genuinely concerned about whether it would continue in Virginia. I remember I was telling you earlier that I was at a colonial parish at my last church, and they were able to sort of weather that storm in part because the preacher was Presbyterian-leaning and Scottish, and he was pro-revolution. So he actually preached from the pulpit to support the Revolutionary War and to support the patriots, so to speak. And that ran counter to how many Anglican pretty stilted things. So you have this new university founded on a vision of rationality, however that might be understood kind of in an 18th century Enlightenment way. Very optimistic view of human nature and of what science can achieve. We see that in Jefferson's view about Unitarianism sweeping the nation, right? So what are the first few years at the University of Virginia like? What ends up happening as these ideals are put in place?
Well, they're sorely tested. Jefferson understood when he was establishing this university that his first challenge, it's not his number one challenge in terms of difficulty, but his first challenge is to get funding out of the state of Virginia, which was not in the business of spending money, it was in the business of keeping taxes low. He manages to pitch them with support from a group of other leading Virginians who were concerned about the relative decline of Virginia and saw establishing their own university as something that could help to reverse this decline. They were also frankly concerned, and you referred to this earlier, about if their sons aren't going to William and Mary, they would be going to Princeton and Harvard and Yale, and those are places which have turned against slavery. They're in states that have turned against slavery. So there is concern that their sons are going and learning some ideas that elite Virginians aren't comfortable with. Now, just about all of the Virginians that I know of that went to these institutions, they do write some letters home to their parents and get their fathers agitated because they say things like, "Don't you think we should free the slaves?" And the fathers decide, "Well, I can't pay for you to go to college if we free the slaves." They end up coming back to Virginia and running the plantation, and they stop talking about this stuff. So in fact, what Jefferson and others were afraid of is not something they should have been afraid of. The fear is so powerful that they decide that they've got to educate their kids, their sons, in the South. So in some ways it seems surprising. The first public universities in the United States were all established in southern states. And they're founded for similar reasons. So the University of Georgia, what becomes the University of South Carolina, the University of North Carolina are all older than UVA. So UVA is going to be the fourth in the series of southern state universities. And they're all established because the leaders of those states want their sons to stay home for higher education. The problem is that the sons of the elite in these southern states are people who've grown up in a plantation society that takes a great deal of pride in their conviviality, in being able to drink a lot, to gamble, to be gregarious, generous, but also to have a very powerful sense of honor. And honor means that you cannot accept an insult.
You might have to duel somebody.
And you might have to duel, but the thing is, you only duel against somebody that you regard as your social equal. Okay? If you regard them as your social inferior, you must chastise them in some way, but you do not duel them. Duel says, I accept you as my equal, and we're going to risk each other's lives in order to establish an honor. Now, you take 13, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds and tell them that you have to have this powerful sense of honor and you must never accept an insult. Because if you accept an insult, that means you're a slave. Because slaves have to accept insults and they have to accept chastisement because of the imbalance of power. And these are young men who are being trained literally at their homes to become future masters. It means they make terrible students. You send them off together, and they don't want to listen to any authority figure over them because they're being trained to be authority figures in their own little worlds. And then you take a whole bunch of them and you put them together. They don't want to listen to professors. Instead, what they'd like to do is insult the professors. So in all of the southern institutions, there's a problem with the young men forming a violent culture in which they are trying to show that they run the universities. So, for example, the University of North Carolina, they developed a phenomenon called the Black Ride, which was that they would steal professors' horses and then ride around hooting and hollering to get the professor's attention. They do this late at night, waving torches, and then they just let the horses go after they've woken up and disrupted the professors. There's a code of silence, which is you never report what another student's done. This is pervasive. This isn't a few students. This is virtually all of the students who are doing this. And Jefferson knows about this. And so he's trying to design UVA in a way that will break down that student culture that comes out of plantation society. And the particular design, the dispersion of the pavilions, the so-called hotels, and then the dorms, which are these low buildings, breaking from the William and Mary model, which was the so-called Wren building, one big building where all the students lived. He said, we're not doing that. We're going to disperse the students, and we're going to put faculty housing interspersed among them, and that will control the students.
Did it work?
It did not work. It means the professors are more isolated and more subject to intimidation by the students whenever the students become unhappy, and the students become unhappy pretty often.
So it sounds like fundamentally there was a mismatch between the culture that existed among elite families in Virginia at the time and this lofty vision that Jefferson had for our society and for the university. All right, great. And how did this connect to the topic of slavery? We've talked a little bit about that, but did the university have any impact in shaping the attitudes of students with regard to slavery?
Well, I would say yes, but not in an anti-slavery direction.
Okay.
I mean,
Would Jefferson have been happy with that, or would he have? Seems like he would have preferred that the university gradually move people towards an anti-slavery view in the long run.
in principle, yes. You know, in principle, he hoped that Virginia would get out of the slavery business.
Right.
But he also insisted, and this runs counter to the kind of optimism about human nature that we ascribe correctly in many ways to Jefferson. He was an utter pessimist about racial coexistence. That, again, doesn't make him unique. This was the common view among leading Virginians who thought slavery's a bad system. It's bad for the people who are masters in terms of their psychology. It's certainly bad for the exploited people who are held in slavery. That was the normal view in that generation. Later generations will develop what they call a positive good idea, insisting that slavery is good for everybody. But in Jefferson's generation, the conventional view of anybody with any education was slavery's terrible. But we're stuck with it because the alternative is to have a lot of free black people around. And for Jefferson and other leading Virginians, that would be a nightmare. Now, many of you may know the famous quote where he says, slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. Right? It's unjust to hold the wolf. But if you let the wolf go, what will the wolf do? It'll attack you. And it's a very telling analogy because they did think of African Americans as seething with rage over how they've been treated over generations, and that if they got the opportunity to move around and get guns, that they would turn on their former masters. So the insistence was, okay, we should free the slaves, but now we got to find out a way to get rid of 400,000 people in a state that doesn't want to pay any taxes, and you have to pay to compensate the masters for giving up the slaves. Where's the money going to come from? If they won't even fund local schools for their own children, are they going to raise the millions upon millions of dollars needed to compensate masters and pay to ship 400,000 people to Africa and ruin their economy while doing it? It's a complete non-starter. But some surprisingly intelligent people like Jefferson and James Madison all believe this concept that ending slavery must be linked to colonization. And by retaining that link, on the one hand, they can continue to say anti-slavery things while trying to reassure themselves and others that that does not sentence them to live with black people in the future. But it doesn't actually do anything to end slavery. And that's the relatively liberal position in Virginia. The more conservative position is we should make the best of slavery. Slavery is the foundation for our entire society and for our entire economy. So deal with it. And that's the position that will prevail in the next generation.
All right, well, I think it'd be a good time to open it up for questions. I'm sure you all have questions about TJ and the emergence of UVA. Yes, Chuck.
You mentioned, Al, that Jefferson's idea of establishing architecturally the academical village to help settle down the ruffians, the roughness and insubordination of the students was his idea, and it didn't work. How long did it take for the university to finally achieve what he wanted, which was, some semblance of order, so that there could be education?
Well, it doesn't happen in his lifetime. So,
As it's still.
well, yes, young people can be raucous, but nothing like it was in the 1820s, right? You do not have duels. You do not have people pulling knives on each other. The level of disorder is just a quantum difference from the kind of disorder that we find in colleges and universities today. So what changes? It doesn't much change at UVA until we get to the later 1840s and early 1850s. And a big part of the change is a cultural change in Virginia, which is toward a more overtly religious culture. Now, it's denominationally diverse, but it becomes much more the norm among leading families in Virginia to adopt this more sentimental, evangelically informed, inflected kind of Christianity. And this is true among the Episcopalians too, but it's also especially true among the Presbyterians, but also among the Methodists and Baptists, who themselves have come to think that having an educated ministry would be a good thing. So there's a shift away from Jefferson's time, when there was an adversarial relationship held by many elite Virginians toward any form of overt Christianity, toward a different style among elite Virginians, which is to thoroughly embrace a Christian style. And the culture becomes more suffused with this. And so you have a chapel that gets built at UVA, and you have young people who are much more inclined to develop the forms of self-discipline that are reinforced by the Christian faith, which was not the case in an earlier time.
Any other questions? Yes.
Where did these early public universities in the South that you referenced source their faculty from, and where did UVA source its faculty from?
Where did the faculty come from?
Well, the other southern universities tended to get their faculty from the north. From the north. UVA, Jefferson does not want his faculty to come from the north. Now, you say, well, why don't they come from Virginia? Well, there aren't a lot of people who are educated enough in Virginia for that role. Plus, they know what a difficult time it would be to teach Virginians. So to be a professor was considered kind of a menial role. And so education had a very low status in Virginia. If you were an elite Virginian, your ideal was to become a lawyer and then go to the House of Burgesses. It is not to become a university or college professor. So if Jefferson is saying, we don't have any Virginians for the job, and anyone we did would not have a high enough social status for these young students to respect, okay, rule them out. And I don't want Yankees coming in, right? because the whole idea was to remove our young people from the influence of Yankees. Where am I going to get professors? And his idea is, I'm going to go to Britain and get them. So the early faculty of UVA, with one exception, who came from Bermuda, are from Britain or Germany. And they've been educated at English institutions, Cambridge or Oxford. Now, that seemed kind of surprising because Jefferson has a reputation of being anti-British in his policies as president, as a politician. But Jefferson has a great capacity to compartmentalize. And if he's got to choose a faculty, he'd rather they would be British because he thinks they'll have a greater prestige and these young men will respect them. Turns out they don't respect them. And the riots at UVA that happened in 1825 are generally with students at night trying to rattle the professors by going around and chanting, "Damn the European professors."
Yes, Karen.
The age of the attendees get a little older.
Well, Jefferson boosted up and said you got to be 16 at least before you go. Okay, so the students are not as young as they were in his time at William and Mary. So no 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds are to be at UVA. But the great majority of them are there when they're 16 and 17. Because almost, again, at UVA, as in William and Mary in the past, almost nobody graduates. And very few will be there for more than 2 years. So it starts to skew a little bit older when we get into the 1840s and the 1850s. And you start to get more young men who are coming in their mid-20s for education. And a somewhat, more into the middle class in terms of where students are coming from. So it's still the elite families, but the number of students at UVA grows substantially. At Jefferson's time, it's between 100 and 150 students, which is less than what he'd hoped. He was hoping for about 220. And it peaks in 1825, it goes down in 1826, and then it's at a low level until we get to the 1840s, and then it starts to grow. But it grows up to around 500 students, which is, of course, tiny compared to a university today with thousands of students.
When does the graduation rate become, say, a majority of students?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. But I'm pretty sure it doesn't happen until after the Civil War.
After the Civil War. Wow. Yes.
What was the typical student day like when they weren't rioting or being
That is the typical
student.
That the 10% of the day they weren't rioting or partying, what were they doing?
Okay, so these are students who do not want to do any menial tasks. So they don't want to black their own boots. They don't want to clean their own rooms. So the university has subcontracted this all out to people called hotel keepers. So I'm sure that almost all of you are familiar with the landscape architecture at UVA. There are these structures called the hotels. They were essentially people would rent them, and the people who rent them have the obligation to provide meals to students and to provide these other services. In order to do so, their staffs consist of enslaved people. So the university has the students who are front and center in the dorms, but in the spaces in between the pavilions and the hotels, enslaved people live, often in the basements of these buildings, but also in the areas in between. So that the number of enslaved people living on the grounds was at least equal to the number of students. So your day as a student, you get up, you have to get up quite early, there's a system of bells, you have to get up and start to go to class. Right? So you have to put your clothes on. Your boots have been blacked the night before. You go off to class, and every time there's a change, there's ringing of bells, and you go to your next thing, if you attend. And attendance was a pretty sporadic thing. There's always the attractions of going back to your dorm and gambling with your friends and drinking at all hours of the day. And then making trouble at night for the professors. But also abusing the enslaved people is something that was all too routine. So the disciplinary records of the early university are a very rich social source. And it's every week there's stuff going on that involves some form of violence. Student-on-student violence, student-on-faculty violence, but student-on enslaved people violence is probably the most routine. It's this slave did not serve me fast enough, or didn't black my boots the way I did, and I complained about it and they were insolent. So there's a perception among these young men that they have an obligation to violently discipline people they consider insolent who are not fitting into their place. But they do go to class sometimes too, so that's part of the day too.
Richard?
UVA has an honor code. Does that emerge at the very beginning, or does that appear later?
It appears, I forget the exact date, I think it's the 1830s. And it's an interesting development because by creating this honor code, the faculty are trying to reinvent the concept of honor. Right? So the concept of honor, the way it had operated, was for students to protect each other from authority being exercised on them. But it also leads to conflicts among these young people over whether they're insulting each other. So the faculty are trying to say, no, honor means that you don't cheat, and that you go to class, and that an honorable person does those, is honest in their work and goes to class. And so they're trying to reinvent honor, and that's the emergence of the honor code. So kind of in the traditional history of UVA, that the creation of this honor code is given credit for bringing discipline to the university. And I'm saying it's not inconsequential doing that, but it would not have worked without this larger change in the religious culture of Virginia.
So in a way, if Jefferson's Unitarian dream had come true, maybe the honor code would not have been as well established in UVA?
Well, he believed that rationality alone should lead people toward engaging in forms of honor, such as the honor code.
You're skeptical about that.
Well, as a historian, you look at the record, and I'm not going to make any universal statements.
Yeah.
But I'm going to say that in 19th century America, you are not going to get any kind of code of self-discipline that is not, that will work for large numbers of people unless it's linked to religious faith. Again, just 19th century America, not any other time.
In that particular context.
Yeah.
Yes, Lance.
How much weight did Thomas Jefferson's presence and voice carry later in his life in the 1810s and 1820s within the kind of university's environment? And once he passed in the 1820s, did that create any sort of vacuum for the university?
Yeah. So the university gets founded. The Central College gets established during 1817, but the Central College never accepts any students. So the university likes to claim Central College as its predecessor and claim that the university goes back to 1817. But in fact, the University of Virginia is created in 1819 and then will take over the buildings under construction for Central College. The university does not open until 1825, March of 1825, in terms of receiving students. And this is because Jefferson is playing a game of chicken with the Virginia State Legislature. The Virginia State Legislature keeps saying, well, you've got a few buildings that are completed, why don't you start bringing some students in? And Jefferson's saying, I'm not bringing any students in until you build the whole thing. Right? Because he had this pessimism about the political leaders of Virginia, that if they got students in there, they'd stop putting funds in toward buildings. And Jefferson is in love with his architectural design, and he wants the full thing to be built. Okay, so he's playing this game of chicken, and he wins. But it means that there's this 6-year period in which the state is funding a university, but no students are going to it. So it opens in 1825. Jefferson will die in 1826. So the university is only open for about 14 months before he dies. He's very elderly, he's in bad health. He does try to go down to UVA on a regular basis. He also has a telescope up at Monticello. He's watching what's going on. He's mostly concerned whether the enslaved people are building the thing in the right way, which is easier to see than to see what's going on in the dorm rooms with the students. Jefferson's a presence, and every Sunday he would have a dinner where he'd invite a group of students to come up to Monticello. There is a great deal of reverence by the students toward Jefferson, but again, they can compartmentalize too. They can do this and still do everything else they're doing to defy their professors, which is not what Jefferson wants. And it leads to this great crisis when there's this big riot on October 1st, 1825, and it practically breaks Jefferson's heart that this happens. And he finds out that it's his grandnephew who's the ringleader of it, who's a student at UVA. And it's a very moving story about the meeting of the Board of Visitors with Jefferson there. He gets up to speak and he can't. He's so choked with emotion. And when Jefferson dies, it does leave this big vacuum. But it's a vacuum that John Hartwell Cock wants to fill. John Hartwell Cock had been one of the prime movers of the university, but he'd always wanted it to be a more Presbyterian-inflected institution. And he's somebody who wanted a religious structure to the university. And when Jefferson goes, Madison becomes the head he becomes the rector of the university. But Madison's also elderly and not a confrontational guy. And John Hartwell Cock is a very strong-willed guy. And John Hartwell Cock is the guy that will start to try to reinvent the university and make it a much more disciplined place. Now, it's tough sledding for him in the 1820s and 1830s, but he's going to keep working at it. And ultimately, so I don't think we, in our received history of the university, Jefferson looms so large that we forget the other people who also helped to create it. And if there's a number, if Jefferson, I would say Jefferson's 1A, but Cock is 1B. And they had very different visions for what the university should be. Initially, Jefferson's vision is triumphant, but in the longer run, it's Cock's vision that will end up stabilizing the university.
Very interesting. Well, we've come to the end of our time today. Let's give Professor Taylor a round of applause. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.